G'day folks, my name is Rob, welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 11 ahead of the British Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so on the road to 1,000 subscribers. So thanks to all of you that have already engaged with the channel and the content. Before we jump into my team selection, just want to take a quick look at how the team did in Austria. I had the 3 times extra DRS boost on Max. He absolutely hauled, dominated the weekend from start to finish. P1 in qualifying, won the sprint, won the race, and then had the fastest lap on the last lap of the race to pretty much put the icing on the cake. So very happy with how that went. A couple of overtakes as well. So very pleased with the outcome there. I'd had my eyes on using this chip since the start of the season because of the stronghold Max and Red Bull have over this circuit. So very glad I went with my gut and it paid off. Perez also had that 2 times, another solid weekend from a fantasy perspective for him. Unfortunately, just seems to be making a meal of these qualifying sessions lately, but still managed to get the car all the way up to 3rd on Sunday. Did 2nd in the sprint and a few overtakes and positions gained as well throughout the weekend. So very happy across the board with how things went for him. And then the Aston Martin boys shipped in with 20 plus points apiece. Joe rounded out the team with 10. So as perfect as a weekend can go, I think I'll carry some of this momentum into the mid-season break, hoping to crack top 10 by a halfway mark. Currently at 17.6, coming in from around 140. So I think hopefully can take some of this traction and push the team forward to make those moves into the second half of the season. As far as team selection for the British Grand Prix is concerned, I still think I'm going to be rolling with the template. I don't have enough budget to get up to someone like a Sonoda or an Alex Albon. Joe, for whatever reason, hasn't moved in price despite averaging more points per race than every driver under 8 million. But I think he's still an excellent driver at that price. Unfortunately, I can't really get to Sonoda. I really like him, and I think it would be great to have a little bit of variety in the team. But I just can't really see myself going with De Vries or Sargent because of the rookies. We've seen a few mistakes from them. Just not really encouraged from their performances. Sargent had a great performance in Austria, his best of the season in my opinion, and was kind of running around that P10 before he lost positions. Hulkenberg is an absolute no-go. The guy just seems to lose positions on Sunday like it's his job. He does have a great Saturday. We've seen a lot of really good qualifying performances from him, but the single lap pace from that Haas doesn't convert to a full race, and tyre degradation also doesn't seem to work in his favour either. So I can't really see myself rolling with any of these 3 guys at 4.5 and below. So by process of elimination, it's Joe again for the 3rd week in a row. Very happy with how the Aston Martins have been doing. I think these upgrades are going to push them back closer to the top 2 or 3 teams if they're not already there. And yeah, as I said, Red Bull aren't going anywhere. So that's pretty much where I'm at right now. Did put some questions out on Twitter, F1 Fantasy Hub on Twitter. A lot of really useful information I'll put out if you're not familiar with it in the lead up to the race weekend. As far as chip usage is concerned for this weekend, no negative, the only real logical one because of the weather warning. It's not meant to be severe by any means, but there is expected to be some chance of rain on the Saturday, and I think after what we saw in qualifying last year where Sainz ended up on P1 in a wet qualifying session, we might see something similar in Silverstone this Saturday. You might well see teams in the midfield or even back markers put that car up into P10 or around that mark when tyre strategy becomes so much more important in those wet sessions. So definitely something to watch, but really the use of the no negative holds much more value on the Sunday when there are more points and a higher chance of a DNF on offer. So just something to keep in mind, but the chance of rain halves in that 24-hour period in Sunday, and by the time the race rolls around mid-afternoon on Sunday, it's expected to be completely dry. So we may not need to activate no negative, but just something to keep in mind if the weather takes a turn for the worse in the lead up to qualifying and the race. Obviously, the deadline is qualifying, so wait until as late as possible to make your decision on whether or not you want to roll with that. Don't really see the value in using any other chips this weekend after just using one in Austria, but I think a lot of these chips carry the most value on sprint weekends. So given that this isn't one of them, I would hold off using Limitless, Extra DRS or Autopilot. As far as Limitless is concerned, we did see quite a bit of use from of that chip in Austria because of the sprint race weekend. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities to use that throughout the season, but I don't see Silverstone as one circuit that really warrants use because of the sprint or the lack of sprint this coming weekend. Obviously, it's a great way to make up rank and points in your leagues, but there are going to be certainly many better opportunities down the line to do so. Qatar for me is the standout circuit at the moment because of the lack of rain. Obviously, there's I guess some degree of risk because that hasn't been on the calendar for a little while, and the drivers are not going to be familiar with the circuit. So I think realistically, if the weather, which won't be an issue, stays true, that could be a great opportunity to use it. Circuit of the Americas, another circuit that just about everyone on the grid knows quite well. That's a sprint race weekend. Typically quite dry conditions down in Austin too, so that could be another really good opportunity. And then you've also got Spa and Interlagos at different points. Spa a little quite soon actually, in a few weeks. Interlagos, one of the last races on the calendar and the last sprint race I believe too. So definitely some options there and plenty of time to weigh that up, but I think using the Limitless in one of those last 3 sprint races is great because the gap to the Red Bulls will have closed substantially more. There'll be plenty more drivers in the mix like Leclerc, Hamilton, etc. that will be competing for podiums if not wins. So I think kind of hedging your bets and going for those drivers later in the year when there's more up for grabs certainly I think extracts a little bit more value out of the chip. As far as the best drivers to choose for this chip, as of right now, because it's hard to say what the teams and the best teams and drivers will be later in the season, I think you still got to have double Red Bull constructor. So that's another reason why I can't see their value right now in using Limitless, because so many people are piled in on triple Red Bull. I think if you want to go for more differentials waiting later in the year, when you could go say a Mercedes and a Ferrari, or a Mercedes and an Aston Martin, or a Ferrari and an Aston Martin, is going to reap more reward if the Red Bull isn't quite as dominant and ahead of the field as it currently is. And then, yeah, so right now it'd be triple Red Bull. I'd probably go Hamilton and Leclerc as the other 2 drivers, and then take a pick out of Alonso, Sainz, or George Russell. And then as far as your second constructor, I think it's probably got to be Mercedes or Ferrari. They're a toss-up at the moment for me. Mercedes were looking good up until Austria. They seem to fall off the pace a little bit, so just kind of play it by ear, but realistically, I don't really see the value, as I've said, in using Limitless again until we get to a sprint race. As far as Lewis Hamilton's concerned, he has a great record at Silverstone. He's won 8 titles, the most of any driver there, and comes into, I guess, this weekend hoping to improve on how he did in Austria. I think there's obviously a lot of hype around the Mercedes at their home race and his home race, so definitely a driver to keep your eye on. As far as fantasy is concerned though, not someone I'm jumping at, only because it requires quite an upheaval of your team to make a pretty substantial change to your lineup if you did want to get him in. I think logically, if you wanted to keep Max as your 2 times, then you'd have to make Perez the scapegoat. That would mean getting in 2 budget drivers in Hulkenberg and Sargent, at least in my case anyway, because I don't have budget to stretch to anyone else. And personally, I don't like this lineup whatsoever. These 2 guys don't fill me with any confidence at all for the reasons mentioned. And, you know, comparing these 3 to a Perez, which is already, I think, in a stronger car than the Mercedes, against Stroll and Zhou, who are both better drivers than these 2 right here at the moment from a fantasy output perspective, it's a no-brainer to not roll with this lineup here. The only other option, again, this is for you Lewis Hamilton super fans, if you do want him in your team or you're currently rolling with him, is to go and replace someone like Max in favour of Lewis. I think if you're going in that direction, you have to get Perez back in because he is in that Red Bull. It's just so good at the moment. That leaves you with 17 million. So if you can stretch to Pierre Gasly and Lance Stroll, I think that's the obvious choice. Gasly, from a fantasy output perspective, hasn't looked great the last couple of weeks. I think he's been kind of high single digits. Yeah, 8 and 7. 7 on a sprint race, not encouraging really either. So just because of that doesn't mean I think he's a bad driver. And I think if you're going for a non-budget route, probably the best. The others, if you can't get to him like me in this case, it doesn't really leave you with any drivers that I think are going to consistently put that car in the top 10 or so. Bottas hasn't looked great at all. Zhou has been out driving him. Piastri only had a great Saturday sprint, even though he came away with quite a haul of points on the weekend. And then Magnussen's been hot and cold all season. Single digit one weekend, double digit the next. So these are all pretty unpredictable drivers, which is why I'm just not convinced Lewis is the play at the moment. But again, if you feel strongly about having him in your team, then I would probably go for I'd probably still, I don't know, it's a tough one to call, but I think Max the 2 times, given how dominant the Red Bull is, has to be in my team. So it would probably mean Hamilton in for Perez and then the 2 budgets as I set out. So yeah, I think that's an option, but probably not something for me. And then as far as how the weather will impact things, as I touched on, we've got probably a wet qualifying expected, and I think that's going to shake up the grid order for Sundays. So lots to kind of think about, and as I mentioned, try and leave your decisions as late as possible until the deadline, because more information is always going to be key. But I think that's going to be it for me this week. A very quick team selection, final thoughts, race week preview all in one. But if you do have any thoughts to the contrary about what I said, please drop it down in the comments. Follow me on Twitter, as I'll be pushing out my race week preview thread ahead of the deadline, as I always do. And if you've got any questions, do hit me up, as mentioned, on YouTube, on Twitter. But guys, thank you very much for watching. Appreciate all of the love and support so far. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.